Hi, this is Robert with Cruzbike, and today we're going to be assembling a Cruzbike Q45. Hey, it's Robert again. I have my Cruzbike toolkit ready to assemble my Q45 and a box cutter to open up my new box. So let's see what's inside. Inside your Q45 box you should find 2 parts boxes, Cruzbike toolkit, our nice small welcome pamphlet, any accessories you may have ordered, and once you have all those things out, your Q45 will lift straight out of the box like this. Once you have the bike out of the box, we will begin by removing all the zip ties and protective foam holding the wheels on and any other materials until we have completely removed all the zip ties off the frame and off the wheels. Also inside, between the padding, you will find the seat back and seat base wrapped together nice like that. Once we have everything unpacked here, we're going to lay our frame down nice and easy so we don't scratch the paint. Once you have everything unpacked, you should have your front and rear wheels unpacked, your main frame. We still have yet to remove the wrapping and protective foam from the main frame. Should also have your welcome booklet, your Cruzbike toolkit, seat base and seat back. In our 2 parts boxes, we have the front and rear wheel skewers and pedals, reflectors. And in the other box, we have all the parts needed to put the seat onto the bike. We also have our seat pad here. And now that we have accounted for all our parts, let's do some assembling. Our first task is to remove all of the protective packing material from the frame, taking care not to scratch any paint. Once you have magically removed all of the packing materials, it's time to get assembling. We have the front boom, slider, and chainstay and crank assembly is completely separate from the front end of the bike once you remove all the packaging. We have the handlebars and shifters pre-cabled. We'll get to those. We also have our seat tube already installed, ready to go. And we have the parts we need, our toolkit. We have the seat base. We also have our seat brackets and skewers and parts. We'll get to those a little later. We also have our other bike parts, our front and rear wheel skewers, our pedals, reflectors, chain, and seat pad. The first thing we're going to do is move everything aside that has to do with the seat and clear our way for the main frame assembly. Here we're going to use a wheel stand in order to make our lives a little bit easier, especially if you are doing this assembly by yourself. We're going to take our front triangle, which is all assembled. We're going to be loosening up some of that a little bit later, but for now we're just going to set it aside. It'll make the main frame much easier to assemble. If we use a wheel stand to hold the rear wheel, we'll have a much easier time lifting the frame and lowering it down onto the rear wheel. Make sure in the disc brake caliper you remove the protective paper that is between the pads, and that'll make getting the wheel much easier to get on into the dropouts. If for some reason you have a hard time getting the rotor in the caliper, remember it is loose. Also check your brake cables up at the lever. Sometimes during packing they can get pulled out and lodge up against the stops. Once we have our wheel in place, we're going to insert our rear wheel skewer with the lever on the brake side and tighten the rear wheel down. With the rear wheel installed, we can now move to install the drive wheel, or the rear wheel on a cruise bike. We're going to set our front end aside again, and we're going to very carefully lift up, moving the derailleur out of the way, making sure we've removed the small protective cardboard out of the caliper. We don't need that. And we're going to simply lift the front fork up, and we are going to lower it down onto the dropouts. And for now, we're just going to let it sit as we move on to installing the main front end. As we see here on the rear brake, the caliper is still loose. Remember that, it's for when we do our final brake adjustment at the end. Quick note, we have a new fender mount installed here, pre-installed from the factory, making it easier to install your rear fenders. We have our bottle cage mounts under the seat, if you want to mount a bottle cage on either side of the frame. Now, before we move on to the main assembly of the front end, we have to check the alignment of our pivot clamp. Here we see the pivot clamp is off just a little bit. What we want is for this front edge of the clamp to be completely aligned with the axle line of the wheel. If your pivot clamp is misaligned, simply remove the cap off of the 5mm bolt. We're going to loosen our side bolts. We don't have to fully remove them, we just have to loosen it about 1.25 turn. We're going to loosen our star nut a little bit. We're going to remember to loosen it an exact 1 turn, and then we can very carefully twist and align the front edge of our pivot clamp with the axle line of the wheel. We want this to be as even as we possibly can. Once everything is aligned, tighten the top cap exactly 1 turn, since you loosened it 1 turn, and then tighten the side bolts to secure the pivot clamp to the fork. Moving on to our main front end, you will notice there is a notch on one side of the chainstay. That is for the derailleur to seat into. The derailleur hanger only goes one way. It will press fit into the chainstay once you tighten the front wheel skewer. What we're going to do now is we're going to place the chainstay over the fork. We just have to spread it a little bit, and then we're just going to set this on the ground. And then we are going to take our front wheel skewer, which is the longer one, as you see here. Now, it's important that we take the springs off the skewer and we throw them out. We do not want to use the springs on the skewer here. They will only become jammed in the holes on the chainstay. Once we've removed the springs, we will insert the skewer. We won't all the way insert it though. We will leave about 1 inch. That way we can take our rear derailleur hanger and fit it concave side towards the fork, between the fork and the chainstay, making sure it is in the notch. And once we have that set, we can push our front skewer all the way through, tighten the nut, and we will want to tighten this all the way securely closed, and then we're going to open it again so we can still pivot the front chainstay up to finish assembly of the boom and slider to the pivot clamp. As you can see here, leaving that front skewer loose has allowed us to pivot the entire assembly up and down. Before we can fully install it, however, we will want to loosen the slider clamp with a 5mm Allen out of our Cruzbike toolkit. You can move it up 6 or 7 inches onto the boom. We'll have to do a final ride adjustment later. We will want to snug it down just a little bit at this time, and then we will want to remove the pivot clamp bolt. This is pre-installed at the factory. It is very important, however, to note that on the small bolt there will be one washer on the outside, and on the large slider portion there will be two washers on the outside when we reassemble. The washers do not go on the inside of the pivot clamp. Pivot the front end up. If it is very difficult to pivot up and move, loosen the 4mm bolt at the top of the chainstay at the bottom bracket. We will then slide our pivot clamp bolt through the pivot clamp and put the bolt on the other side. Remember, we have one washer on the bolt side and two washers on the sleeve side. And we do not tighten this bolt at this time. We leave it a little loose for us to route our cables later. Now I'm going to move our wheel stand to the front wheel, like so. This will keep the front end nice and sturdy, allowing us to finish the assembly of the front end with the handlebars and the cables and the chain and the pedals without the front end being able to move on us. Now, to make sure our handlebars are going to be aligned, we will loosen the boom clamp and we will line up the handlebar clamp with the horizontal, so that way when we remove our handlebar clamps and install our handlebar, it will be nice and level. Using our 4mm Allen, we will loosen and remove the 4 handlebar clamps so we can install our handlebar. We will keep the clamps and the bolts on hand for our installation of the handlebar. Now note the orientation of the cables. You might have to rotate the handlebar around a few times. We will have our cables here, and we will position the handlebar so it is vertical. The hand grips should be vertical up and down. That's a good starting position. And then we will very carefully install our handlebar clamps, making sure when we tighten the clamps that there is an even gap on the top and the bottom. If we tighten one side all the way against the other and do not have an even gap, it can lead to those clamps being stressed out and possibly breaking. So we want to make sure we have nice even gap top and bottom when we snug these bolts. Now, remembering that we only hand tighten the bolt on the pivot clamp a couple turns, we are now going to very carefully remove it just for a brief moment, and it will allow us to put the cables underneath the pivot clamp in the gap between the clamp. Note if one of your cables ends up on the wrong side of the boom, as I will show you here. I will show you an easy way to disconnect it and then route it on the correct side of the boom. Here we see that the cable ended up on the wrong side of the boom when we installed the handlebars. That's no problem. We are simply going to line up our openings for the brake lever, and we're going to pull that cable out. We will reroute it through the pivot clamp, making sure it's on also the right side of the frame at the fork, and then we will simply reinstall that cable and snug down the adjuster. And now our cables are routed on either side of the slider and underneath the pivot clamp. Once we have made sure our cables are routed properly, we will use our 2 5mm Allens out of our toolkit to snug down the pivot clamp, making sure this connection is nice and tight before we proceed. Next, we're going to install our pedals. Here I've put a little bit of grease on the pedal threads before starting. Also note, if you look inside the pedal, you will see that each one is marked with a left or right. So when you find the right side pedal, that pedal goes on the chainring side. The left side pedal will go on the non-drive side. We'll get our threads started here, and if we back pedal, we should be able to rotate the pedals onto the cranks. And here you will want to use a dedicated pedal wrench or a skinny crescent wrench to tighten the pedals into the cranks. We don't want to over tighten these, but we want to make sure they're nice and secure so the pedals do not come loose. Now we'll move on to the seat assembly. For the seat, we want to attach the base to the lower mounts. We're going to have the shorter mount in the front, the longer mount in the rear. We're going to save the third mount with the angled slot for the seat back. So here we will use our 6mm bolts and washer and a 6mm nylock nut. We're going to install the front bracket, the shorter bracket, in the second set of holes. The second set of holes is our good starting position. And then in the second set of holes from the back, we're going to use our hardware to install the longer bracket. And here on this back one in particular, we only are going to thread the nuts in very little, 1.5 threads. We want the back bracket to be nice and loose. We'll take our J-Cool tool and fashion our 10mm nut driver. And using that and a 4mm Allen, out of our toolkit, we will tighten the fronts, and we are going to, for now, leave the backs very loose. We want that as loose as we can. Now, when we go to install the seat base onto the mounts, we're going to put the front end first. And now that we have the front end on and the back end is loose, we can pivot it right down onto the frame. And after we have done that, then we will use our 10mm nut driver and our 4mm Allen, and we will tighten the rear bolts and nuts nice and secure onto the rear mount. Once we have done that on both sides, we will install our skewers that hold the seat base to the frame. I like to put the lever sides on the brake side since that's where all the other levers are. And then we will install our seat back. We're going to use the lower set of holes. You can use the upper or lower set of holes depending on how much seat recline you would like. And using our 5mm nuts with the slots angled downward, we are going to install, in the same fashion we did on the base, the seat back bracket with our 5mm hardware and our 8mm nut driver and 3mm Allen for these particular bolts. Once we have secured that, we can then take our seat back and, using our last couple 6mm bolts, insert the bolts through the holes in the seat back. And then we will hold our 2 black rubber washers onto the bolts, rest the seat back onto the holes of the seat base, and once that's rested in place, we will use our final M6 washer and M6 nylock nut. We will thread these on by hand. And then we will use our J-Cool tool with a 10mm nut driver and a 4mm Allen. And the goal is to only secure the nuts until the head of the bolt is flush with the end of the nut. That will make the seat back just snug enough, but not over tight. So that way the seat back has a little bit of flex back and forth for its angle. We will now take our seat back bracket and a skewer, same as we used on the seat base, and we will attach the bracket to the seat tube. Here I'm going to use the second set of holes. It's a good starting position for the Q45. And now we're going to attach it to the bracket. Note, if the alignment is off, simply loosen the skewer holding the seat tube and give it a little bit of rotation, so then you can fit the seat back onto the bracket and install our final skewer in through the seat. And once we have that nice and tight, we will secure all the skewers, including the seat tube skewer, the seat back bracket skewer. Make sure everything's nice and secure. We're going to want to shift our derailleur all the way down to make sure that the small cog and the jockey wheels of the derailleur line up. Here I will demonstrate if they do not line up. We will make sure the shifter is shifted completely down to the lowest gear. We'll find the inner adjustment screw on the derailleur located at the back here. We'll use our 3mm Allen to loosen this screw, which should allow the end limit of the derailleur to line up with the smallest wheel on the cassette. It's very important to make sure those wheels line up, so look straight down the cassette to make sure that the jockey wheel lines up with the edge of the cassette. That way we will have nice clean chain alignment when we install the chain. If you're uncomfortable undoing the cables or adjusting the shifting on your cruise bike, we recommend a bike shop for a final check over and adjustment once everything is installed. Now we can install our chain, which we will locate here. We will also want to make sure when we open the chain that we do not lose track of the quick release chain link, the quick link. It should be inside the package. It's 2 pieces. We will want to make sure we have both of those in hand for when we do our chain install. Now that we have lined up our derailleurs and made sure everything is nice and aligned there, we're going to open the cage and press the lock button to lock it open. Note when you drape the chain over the chain rings that the chain ring is a narrow wide, meaning there's a wider tooth and a narrow tooth, and they alternate. The chain will only fit on the chain ring one way with the wide opening on the wide tooth, etc. When we drape our chain over the first cog and the chain ring, we'll want to take note of that, making sure everything is nice and lined up. Once we have that, we can route our chain over the jockey wheel, over the first one, and then we will want to pass through the guard. We want to make sure we're not getting hung up on the metal bracket, and then we'll go under the last jockey wheel, making sure we have a nice smooth flow of the chain. It's important to note on the NX derailleur, the jockey wheels are constructed in a similar narrow wide fashion. So we'll want to make sure that those jockey wheels are seated in the chain and we have nice smooth movement of the chain through the wheels. Once we have everything into position there, we can attach our quick link pieces on the left side and right side of the chain. They can go on either one. We will put those together. Now, if you cannot pull this link tight, which is rarely the case, we will simply hold the link, carefully rotate the chain over so we have our quick link at the top on the drive side of the chain. And once we have that in position, we will pull the quick link shut, making sure we also close the derailleur cage to put tension on the chain. We'll now remove the Velcro from the seat cushion. I like to install the lower portion first, sticking the base to the base of the seat, making sure it's nice and secure. And then I like to remove the velcro from the pad itself and stick them right on the outside edge of the seat. Pretty much our last step is to install our rear reflector and our front reflector on the handlebar. Before we do our final brake adjustment, you'll want to take note of the orientation of your brakes. Typically on a bicycle, the right lever will control the rear brake and the left lever will control the front brake. If your cables have been set up with the front brake on the right and the rear brake on the left, you can certainly run it this way. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you are used to it with it routed the other way, we can simply undo the cables, lining up our cable slots with the slot in the lever, pulling and loosening the cables, and simply rerouting them and reattaching the cables in the lever, and then routing the cable through the slot back into the lever. And now we have our standard left lever controlling the front brake and right lever controlling the rear brake. We'll now move on to our brake adjustment. The calipers up until this point are loose, and now we will want to make them level and centered on the rotor. We'll tighten our bolts with our 5mm Allen, and we'll work until we have a nice even spinning wheel, and we will repeat for the front. Again, if you're uncomfortable adjusting your brakes, then this is a good job for a local bike shop. Very critical adjustment. You want to make sure your brakes are properly adjusted. And that should do it for your assembly of your Cruzbike Q45. Again, see our other videos for fit adjustments. Make sure all your fasteners and quick release levers are secure before riding. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at support@cruzbike.com. Thanks for watching.